Most of you are very idealistic students, they want to do good. But why? What is morality? Is that what the majority calls good?
Morality is a social construction. I think we humans, we invented it.
Primarily the reason to do good might be just self-interest, that we feel good about it.
And two experts will guide us through the jungle of morality and doing good. And Jeroen is a philosopher at Free University. He's also active in discussions on faith and science. And we're very happy to have him here.
I want to begin by drawing your attention to what I think is quite a remarkable finding in psychology. So psychologists, as I'm sure you know, are a clever and creative bunch. So they come up with all sorts of smart experiments to test how we think and feel and act. And I want to sort of talk about one particular experiment. And this is originated some decades ago in the work of Elliot Turiel. He's a psychology professor at UC Berkeley. So what they did in this experiment was ask children to consider a situation in which, so very young children, like 4, 5, 6 years, consider a situation in which their teacher told them it was okay not to raise their hands before talking in class. So they explained this to the children, and then they asked them, now that your teacher has said this, do you think it is okay to talk in class without first raising your hand? So let's just do a quick poll here. What do you think their response was? So do you think the children then thought it was okay to talk in class without raising their hands? How many of you think that? Yeah, so so that's good. Quite a few of you. And you're right. So most of the children, when they were told this, to consider the situation, they thought it was then okay for them to talk in class without first raising their hand. The other situation that the children were invited to consider was a situation in which their teacher told them, it's now okay to hit your schoolmates, your classmates, if you feel like it. And then again, they were asked, so your teacher has said this, it's okay to hit your classmates if you want to. Is it now okay to do so? So again, who thinks the children then said it would be okay for them to hit their friends, their classmates, if they felt like it? Yeah, so that's significantly less than before. So interestingly, the few people that raise their hands are wrong in this instance. So most kids thought it would not be okay to do so, even after their teacher had told them that it was okay. So they repeated this experiment in different cultures, with kids of different ages, even preschool kids, all the way up to adults also, in sort of similar and different scenarios, so lots of variation. And what's sort of the result that comes out of this is that children from a very young age onwards draw a distinction between different types of norms. On the one hand, sort of purely conventional norms, like raising your hand in class before you ask a question. And on the other, moral norms. So not hitting your classmates. And they think that these norms are different in the sense that moral norms hold unconditionally. They hold universally. And they are much more weighty, much more serious than purely conventional norms. So it doesn't matter whether a teacher or some other authority figure tells you it's okay to violate a moral norm. Children from a very young age onwards are still going to think that's not okay. Whereas if a teacher or a parent or some other figure tells you it's okay to violate a conventional norm, so like raising your hand, they're just going to sort of follow what they say. So that's really interesting. And I think these children are onto something. So I do think there's something special about moral norms. And what is special about them is the fact that they hold unconditionally. So they don't depend on how we think or feel about them. they just hold regardless of what people tell us or regardless of how we feel about them. They sort of appeal to us in an unconditional way. Another way of putting this is by saying moral norms are objective. So they don't depend, or at least basic moral norms, like the very fundamentally important ones, are objective. They don't depend on how we think or feel about them. And these experiments give you sort of one sort of reason to think that's true. But here's another reason to think that moral norms are objective. So ask yourself what it's like, from the inside of your head, as it were, to discuss a serious moral issue with someone. So it can be all sorts of things. The permissibility of abortion, of euthanasia, permissibility of factory farming, of eating meat. So a significant moral issue. And then consider what it would be like for you to discuss this with someone who disagrees with you. And ask yourself this: is such a discussion pretty much like a discussion about taste or personal preferences, or maybe about finding some sort of practical compromise that everyone can sort of agree to? Or is it more like a discussion in which you try to convince each other of the truth of your point of view? A discussion, perhaps like a scientific discussion, or a discussion about what the facts of the matter are. A discussion in which you try to give strong reasons, you try and come up with strong objections to your opponent's point of view, and really sort of try to convince each other of the truth or falsity of a particular viewpoint. So is it like a discussion about whether chocolate or vanilla tastes best, or about whether rap music or death metal is, superior? Or is it more like a discussion about whether climate change is real? Say, if you're anything like me, you're going to say, well, these discussions about moral issues are more like discussions about facts and not about taste or personal preferences. And you sort of, just play out the scenario in your head and see if you feel the same way. So I think there's a lot to be said for the idea that moral norms are objective norms. So it's something that very young children assume naturally. I think it's something that fits very well with our moral lives or moral experiences. It also fits well with our practices of holding each other morally responsible for things. But if you're still unconvinced, let me give one final consideration. So ask yourself if something like torturing a child, or harassing women, or slavery, whether that could ever be okay under very different circumstances. So if a society, if societies had a very different shape, if there had been a different constitution, say different laws, or if people all felt and talked very differently about these issues, so if everyone said, slavery is perfectly okay, nothing wrong with that, or, if you feel like it, just grab them by the pussy, just everyone agrees that that's okay. Would that really make it okay? So I think not. And what that shows, again, is that morality doesn't really depend on how we think about it, how we feel about it, or about whether everyone agrees that so-and-so is a moral norm. It's something that holds objectively. All right. And let me just quickly get one possible misunderstanding out of the way at this point. So if I say that moral norms are objective norms, that they hold independently of how we feel about them, I don't mean to say that I or you or anyone for that matter actually knows what all these moral norms are. So I'm not sort of being arrogant in claiming that I know what the right moral norms are. I'm merely saying they hold independently of how we think about them. And that means, there's sort of a project for us in discovering what these moral norms are, finding out what they are. And we can be mistaken about these things. Right? It used to be the case that people thought slavery was acceptable. Now we think it isn't, and for good reason, I think. So I'm not saying that I know all the moral norms, certainly not. Okay, so assume I'm right so far. So there are objective moral norms. This poses something of a challenge or a puzzle. What's their origin? Where do they come from? And here, I want to present to you with one challenge and then propose a possible solution for that challenge. The challenge is this, and in a way it's a very familiar challenge, so you might have read about it before or heard about it before. In a nutshell, it's this. If atheism is true, so if there is no God or any sort of being like God, it's mysterious how there could be objective moral norms. So to the extent that we think there are indeed objective moral norms, as I've been trying to argue, this gives us a reason to think atheism must be false. So why should that be so? Why should we think there can be no moral norms, objective moral norms, if atheism is true? Well, plausibly, if atheism is true, so there is no God, then all we have is physical or material reality. Physical things like cells, molecules, or bigger objects, of course, people, trees, planets, stars, and also all the way down to molecules, atoms, fundamental physical particles, energy, fields, physical things, in short. Now ask yourself, how could a physical thing, or a large collection of physical things, ever produce or give rise to moral norms, objective moral norms? I mean, that seems like a mysterious thing, right? Think about a particular atom. It doesn't seem like any particular atom is or could become or could give rise to a moral norm, right? No physical atoms are ever going to tell you that it's wrong to harass women. At least, no atoms that I've seen. So, and if that's true for atoms, then how could it be different for big collections of atoms or larger constellations of atoms and other particles and energy and what have you, fields? It seems like it's just impossible for these things to ever produce these objective moral norms. I mean, that's sort of like saying, grains of sand on the beach produce traffic laws. Makes no sense, right? It seems we can just see that that's impossible. There's no way that could be true. But if that's right, then there's a serious challenge here for atheism. If there is no God, it's unclear where these objective moral norms could come from. But that means it's also unclear that atheism can sort of make sense of our moral experience, our moral lives, that it can really sort of account for the way we talk and feel and act with regards to morality. And I want to be very clear on this point. By saying this, I'm not at all saying that atheists are morally bad people. Far from it. It has nothing to do with it. The point is, if you believe atheism is true, that seems like it's intention. So intention, there's a conflict there between, sorry, let me rephrase that. If you think atheism is true, that belief is in tension with the thought that there are objective moral norms. So one of the two has to give, it seems. All right, so here's the solution, or at least what I think is a pretty good solution. And you probably sort of see it coming now. So I think theism, so the claim that there is a God, sort of like the Christian God, or the God that all Abrahamic religions talk about, so a supernatural being who's all-powerful, all-knowing, and supremely good. On this picture of what the world is like and where the world comes from, it is much easier to make sense of objective moral norms. So theism, I think, has the resources to explain where objective moral norms could come from. How? Well, most theists think that objective moral norms express the will of God. So why is it bad to enslave people or to harass women, to torture children, or to hit your classmates, for that matter? Because God says so, because God forbids us to do these things. So the thought is, objective moral norms are ultimately grounded in God's will, or God's commandments for us, if you will. Now you might wonder, well, suppose that all of that is true. Suppose there is a God who wills certain things. Why should we care about that, right? What does God have to do with us? Good question. So, on theism, the idea is that God is the ultimate ground of reality, so the creator of everything that exists. And not only that, he also is all-knowing, so he knows what is good for people, for all his creation. And it seems that being our creator and all, he has some claim to our obedience, or at least he has some claim to sort of telling us what to do. So that's why I think we should care about God's will and his commandments. All right, I'm going to close really quickly. A well-known objection against this idea is that it makes morality too arbitrary, right? So if morality is supposed to be grounded in God's will, does that make it arbitrary? I mean, what if God willed us to hit our classmates? Would that then have been good? I mean, that's like the experiment at the beginning that I told you about. If God said, hit your classmates, does that make it okay? So I don't think so. Why not? Well, because on theism, the thought is that God is all good. So it's in God's nature to will only good things, right? So God's commands aren't simply arbitrary. It's not as if he could easily have commanded something else. These commands just follow from his nature that is ultimately good. All right, so in closing, I have put before you 3 ideas. The first is there are objective moral norms. The second is such norms pose a challenge to atheism. The third is they don't pose a challenge to theism. Quite the contrary, theism can easily account for objective moral norms. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeroen de Ridder. Well, he talks so nicely and soft, and just saying there are moral norms, and you should believe in God because that's the best way to understand it. Well, I think some people may have some questions, and we have about 10 to 15 minutes for some questions, especially questions. We have a lot of time for discussions afterwards, also now a little bit time, but especially, do you have questions? Say, okay, I do not understand that, or explain this, or yes. And go upstairs.
I had a couple of questions.
Just one to begin with.
I'll start with one. In the beginning, you proposed that there is such a thing as objective morality. But the arguments that or the examples that you give are based on a sort of unanimity, that we all agree that hitting someone is immoral. Mm-hmm. So my question is, does unanimity, that everyone agrees on something, does that make it objective?
Short answer, no. But, I mean, it could be the case that something is objectively true, and we all know this to be so, and for that reason, we unanimously agree that it is objectively bad. But certainly, when it comes to lots of moral issues, people are divided, strongly divided, right? I mean, I mentioned the examples of abortion or euthanasia, or the discussion here in the Netherlands about a completed life, voltooid leven. I mean, something that really divides people. And in these cases, it just seems unclear what the right answer is, what the right thing to do is. So I don't think, our agreeing unanimously on something is already enough to show that something is objectively true. I mean, it's sort of nice if we unanimously agree, but it's not required.
Okay, first.
Sorry. Thank you for speaking. I'm a little bit conflicted though, because then looking at maybe the Bible, which is a very theistic book, then
Sure.
I see it's not maybe the most emancipated. When looking at women, taking that
Sure, yeah.
grabbing by the pussy example. Not that the Bible says that, not at all, in contrary, but still, it's not very emancipated. And then is that then the objective moral norm that is posed in the Bible?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, perfect question. So of course, it raises lots of really complicated issues about what sort of document the Bible is, or what sort of documents the Bible is, perhaps, about how to interpret them. And these are all sort of important questions that we should really sort of get theologians to talk more about. But I'm still going to say some things. So first of all, I think there's a development within the Bible itself, right? When you go sort of from the Old Testament to the New Testament, there's sort of things that change, and also very morally salient issues that change. So certainly the role of women in the Old Testament is very different from that of women in the New Testament. You might still have doubts about the role of women in the New Testament, but so within the Bible there's already this sort of development about development in moral opinions. Also, I think on a sensible account of what the Bible is and what divine inspiration is, we should really take into account that God. So if you think God reveals himself in the Bible, then he does so in a way that accommodates to people's cultures and times, right? It's not, the Bible doesn't just sort of fall out of the sky, timelessly, and but it's all about God acting in particular places and times. And to some extent, God would simply sort of adjust to local cultures in a way that might sort of, looking backwards, might seem pretty objectionable to us. Because you're right. When you look at the Old Testament, there's some pretty horrific stories there about how women are treated. And difficult as it is for me to sort of imagine God doing that, I do think it must have something to do with the fact that God was sort of accommodating to these people's cultures, because it would have been impossible for him to just provide them with something like, say, 21st century morality, and because that would just have been beyond people. They would have thought this was crazy.
You said physical things can't produce moral norms. This is impossible, and well, I would be inclined to agree. But for example, with animals or monkeys, they tend to show moral behavior as well. So would you say that they also have some sort of moral idea of morality, or?
Yeah, good question. So Frans de Waal's work is very relevant here. He does all these wonderful experiments with primates. So it isn't obvious to me that what these animals do is really the same as moral behavior. Because they certainly show all kinds of social and pro-social behavior, right? So they seem to care about each other. They do take care of each other. They empathize with others. So this is a tricky point, I realize that, but I would be hesitant to call that moral behavior in sort of the full, human sense that we have. Because, okay, so this is, all right, I'm unsure about this. I'm just going to be straightforward about that. Because it seems to me that human morality really does have something to do with our sort of our ability to see moral norms, these objective moral norms, our ability to reflect on those, and I don't think that's something that animals do. They act more instinctively. They certainly don't have the full extent of our reflective capacities.
Thank you. I think the other Jeroen will tell something about that, but maybe we will see. Thank you very much, and I'm very happy. You're doing very good, and I don't care why you do very good, but you're asking questions and you're keeping the time, so for me that's very good. So let's go on, and for the next 50 minutes, for the other Jeroen Hopster, who is working at Utrecht University. He's doing a PhD on evolutionary ethics, the meta-ethical implications of evolutionary explanations of morality. And besides that, he has just published a book a few months ago, and a few years before also a book, so he's also a journalist and a writer. And we're very glad we have two philosophers who are really eager to deal with the broader public and discuss their issues for non-philosophers. So we are very glad, Jeroen, also to have you here, and your 15 minutes of fame.
The book Mothers and Others by the American primatologist Sarah Hardy opens with a scene of Hardy describing how she enters an overloaded airplane. I cite, "With nods and resigned smiles, passengers make eye contact and then yield to latecomers pushing past. When a young man hits me with his backpack as he reaches for the overhead compartment, instead of grimacing or baring my teeth, I smile. disguising my irritation. Most people on board ignore the crying baby or pretend to. When one woman develops a severe migraine in the course of flight, her seatmate helps her, even though they don't speak the same language. I cannot keep from wondering, Hardy continues on the next page, what would happen if my fellow human passengers suddenly morphed into another species of ape? What if I were traveling with a plane load of chimpanzees? Any one of us would be lucky to disembark with all 10 fingers and toes still attached, with the baby still breathing. Bloody earlobes and other appendages would litter the aisles. Compressing so many highly impulsive strangers into tight space would be a recipe for mayhem. End of citation. Humans are an incredibly social species. Our first impulse is to get along. We evolved to cooperate with each other, to live and to act in group settings, to form shared intentions and to conform to shared norms. We are also a compassionate species. Upon seeing somebody in need, our first impulse is to come for help. When we hear about somebody's grievances, we feel empathy. This is the very short 2-minute answer to the question, what motivates us to do good? Such motivation is a basic component of human behavior, ingrained in our moral psychology and manifest in 99% of human interactions. What actions or outcomes we should regard as morally good is, of course, open to debate. With concern to basic acts of altruism, the answer will strike most of us as obvious. But with regard to difficult political issues, for instance, looking at the poster of this event, whether or not we should remove that windmill from the face of our black planet, this is much less the case. Several considerations come into play. An informed decision requires a process of sustained reflection and social dialogue in which different voices are heard and arguments are given. This is perhaps the quintessence of human uniqueness, at least with concern to our moral behavior. Not only did we evolve as a highly social species, with a basic impulse to be considerate towards each other, but we also justify our behavior toward each other and act, at least sometimes, on the basis of reasons. An example. Mother Teresa once said, "If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at one, I will." That's an understandable sentiment. Our moral motivation is not triggered by looking at the indiscriminate masses, but by specific individuals. That's how our sense of empathy evolved. That's also why charity organizations have poster children, and why a powerful photograph, like the Napalm Girl of the Vietnam War, can shape mass opinion and activate people. Just like we are naturally inclined to laugh at videos of cats in boxes, we are moved and motivated to act by the facial features of a single child, the innocent beauty of his or her deep brown eyes, and the human potential we see behind it. But now consider the question what we should do. Should we prefer the fate of an individual over that of the masses? Should we be motivated by looking at one pair of pretty young eyes rather than hundreds of injured bodies? In many contexts, that does not seem the right thing to do. Not the individual, but the masses should carry greater moral weight, as moral philosophers from the utilitarian tradition will tell you. Feelings of empathy can motivate us, but they can also bias us, lead to selective moral attention, and occasionally lead to undesirable outcomes. To be moved by the empathy one feels for the single individual, but to act, nevertheless, in accordance with one's better judgment and give moral preference to the masses, is a kind of behavior that we don't witness anywhere else in the animal kingdom. Such behavior requires you not only to have a basic moral motivation, but also to reflect on your motives, to weigh different values, and to make an endorsed decision. As the primatologist Frans de Waal already mentioned has shown, we are not the only species that is motivated, at least sometimes, at least in some very basic sense, to act altruistically. But we are the only species with the capacity to enter the space of reasons and to engage in a process of reflecting on which motives to pursue. We are the only ones who can motivate their motivation. The question what motivates us to do good has, of course, several dimensions. Institutions can motivate us. Legal institutions, for instance, which typically punish socially harmful behavior, or social and religious institutions, which emphasize and sometimes allow us to further develop our natural feelings of empathy. Friends, role models, and social nudges can motivate us. And to be honest, we should also keep the following in mind. Sometimes we are not motivated to do good at all. But to the extent that we are, our moral motives are typically refined in sophisticated cultural settings, but they did not first originate there. Much of the origin story goes the other way around. These institutions have been shaped to mirror our evolved impulses. They serve, at least in part, to outsource mechanisms of moral control, to reinforce moral demands, and to objectify moral authorities. But in seeking the origins of our moral motivation, we have to look at our basic impulses, which can often be clearly explained in evolutionary terms. Perhaps the most basic of such impulses, seek pleasure and avoid pain, we probably share with all vertebrate species, if not more. Another such impulse, care for your children, can be explained in terms of the biological process of kin selection. The so-called golden rule, treat others as you would like others to treat you, is an example of reciprocal altruism, behavior which reduces one's own fitness at the expense of another, but with the future prospect of the service will be repaid. I'll scratch your back if you'll scratch mine. Which brings me back, in closing, to Hardy's Apes on a Plane. Many apes scratch each other's backs, but no ape has ever donated a substantial amount of his own resources to help conspecifics that he has never met. In this respect, apes are unlike some of us, humans, who do in fact donate money to help poor strangers on distant continents. How to explain that peculiar human behavior? Doesn't it bring about biological costs that will never be repaid? Surely natural selection has not instilled such generosity on us. In fact, we would expect selective pressures to act against it. How then to explain, from a naturalistic perspective, that some people nonetheless feel moved to act selflessly? The naturalist's answer is simple. Indeed, an evolutionary perspective does not explain all the components of our moral judgments. It only gives us their very basic building blocks. That said, these building blocks are quite telling and suffice to demystify the seeds of our moral motivation. Why do we, at least some of us, judge that we should help distant strangers? Because we have generalized our evolved empathy response from the individual to the masses. That's how moral motivation works. Starting from our evolved impulses, which typically orient us towards cooperation, we have modified our judgments in increasingly complex cultural and technological settings with the help of moral philosophers of lessons learned from history in an open-ended process of social deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeroen. Not only a planet of apes, but also a plane of apes. Again, we've got time for questions.
Okay, I wonder how you can explain the existence of people who sacrifice themselves for a greater good, because in my reasoning, without the existence of objective moral truths, such people would extinct, because people like Malala, who get shot by the Taliban, or certain people, when they decide to sacrifice, that's really against their nature. So how do you think such a thing can exist?
Right. Well, I guess there are two answers to that question. First of all, people might, of course, be deceived in thinking that there are objective moral truths, and they might, in fact, act upon that and thereby cause misfortune to themselves and perish. And if the majority of people would be thus conceived, then the majority of people would die and we would all go extinct. So fortunately, that's not the case. But some people might be deceived, and some people actually die while being conceived. The other part of the answer is from a more evolutionarily oriented perspective, is that there might have been taking place far down in our evolutionary history a process of group selection, whereby the benefits of the group rather than the individual counted heavier and counted towards our ultimate reproductive success. So, for example, if a group contains some individuals which will sacrifice themselves, but for the benefits of the majority, then that group might outcompete other groups which consist purely of selfish individuals. So, through such a process of group selection, very selfless acts might actually evolve. So that's a sort of evolutionary mystery. It used to be regarded as a big mystery, something that Darwin was troubled by. And nowadays, that's fairly well established that this is a possible evolutionary explanation of such behavior.
Thank you.
What do you think where empathy is from? Where does empathy originate?
Right. So I think it might have to do a lot with. So we're, like I said, we're a very social species. We are a species which has a long period between growing up and getting mature. So I spent about 18 years living with my parents before I went to university. So there's a lot of interaction and contact in a family setting, and in order to relate with your family and with friends and others and to cooperate and interact, etc., you have to feel a certain basic empathy. If you would be totally oblivious to helping others or to even recognizing others as individuals who might be in need, etc., then this sort of cooperative settings couldn't emerge at all. So I think that it's quite. If you come to think about it, it's quite obvious why we're all here. The setting where we're sitting here is very much like the apes on the plane of my story. And if you were indeed apes, then there would be fights breaking out within 30 seconds. And that's not the case, because we have this basic sort of empathy. And why do we have this sort of basic empathy? Because we have evolved as a cooperative species.
And that side was another question.
I was wondering, in reference to your answer on the first question, how does that pertain to what you said in your talk about the limitations of naturalistic explanations? Because in your answer you seem to strongly infer to a naturalistic explanation of group dynamics, and yet in your talk I got something of you saying that naturalistic inclinations in terms of morality are limited to reciprocal altruism. Like, how should I connect those two? How do they not exclude each other?
So how does what exclude what?
In your talk, you focused on the limitations of naturalistic explanations about morality.
I see what you mean. Okay. I think that it depends what you call naturalistic explanations. I would say actually a naturalistic explanation, as I use the term, will be an explanation which doesn't involve anything supernatural. So, and in that sense, I think I endorse a fully naturalistic account. But you might also read naturalistic in a more restricted way, saying that we can explain everything in biological terms and everything with appeal to our evolutionary history. I think that would be misguided. I think evolutionary accounts are very helpful to explain sort of basic moral impulses, basic sort of cooperation among human beings. But then, if we look at what human morality nowadays is or implies and all the components of it, much of that is very secondary to evolutionary explanations, and we need to have like historical explanations and social explanations, and there's so much more than just these biological building blocks. So this is why also I agree with what Jeroen said earlier on about Frans de Waal and his monkeys, is that moral behavior? No, it's a sort of basic altruistic impulse, but it's not really moral behavior because these monkeys, they don't act on moral motives. We can act upon reasons, and acting upon reasons that involve so much more. It involves language, reflection, etc. So in that sense, I think it's much more encompassing than just the biological part.
Would you say that holds up to his most recent research results, where he says they're actually capable of second-degree moral acts? So I don't know if you've seen the test, but the monkey rejects the reward because his peer doesn't get the same reward.
Right.
So that does seem to entail some level of reflection, and it's, I don't know, how would you say that does not constitute the kind of moral judgment that humans are capable of?
Yeah.
Maybe let me explain the video. It's about two monkeys, capuchin monkeys or something like that. And they have to give a rock and then they get a cucumber. And then to one monkey they gave, further on they gave grape instead of cucumber. And the other monkey who gets the grape, when he sees it, the other monkey gets the cucumber and not the grapes because they prefer the grapes. He refuses to get the grapes and he throws them away. So isn't that like a second order or some kind of feeling of justice in monkeys, or how do you explain that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a fair point. A majority of you must have seen that video because it's been watched more than 30 million times, I think I heard Frans de Waal say, and it has been on De Wereld Draait Door, etc. And that's a good point. So there seems to be this sort of basic sense of fairness in monkeys. But do monkeys refuse that grape because of the punishment of their conspecific for moral reasons? I highly doubt it. I think that there must be some sort of perhaps a sort of innate feeling like innate sort of desire to cooperate, or perhaps, I mean, monkeys, they're smart creatures. They like to play around, experiment, and they try different things. There have also been suggestions that this experiment doesn't replicate under all conditions, so it's questionable whether this is actually such a robust finding. So in general, I think there might be a good sort of biological explanation in the end for this sort of behavior, but one that does not involve the monkey thinking like, let's do this because it's the moral thing to do. I find that very implausible that monkeys would have such thoughts.
It's clear. First there, and then 1, 2.
So you state quite often that there must be something special about humans because we can reflect and actively think about it, if I got you correct? Yeah. So how do you know?
Wow.
Well, that's also a very clear question. How do you know?
Well, I mean, I only know my own mind, but I can have a pretty good idea of what yours will be like. So I think I have the capacity to reflect on that, and I can extrapolate from that to my fellow human beings. Can I do that with other species? To a much lesser extent, but we can study their behavior, and looking at their behavior, there seem to be, well, very ingenious, all sort of ingenious kinds of behavior involved, but I don't think there's any indication that monkeys or other species are engaged in a process on reflecting on their motives. I mean, there's simply no indication for that. So just as we can extrapolate from the behavior of a certain species what its mind from the inside probably will be like or not, I think that's the same for judging whether they have moral motivations or not. So, I mean, of course, I have to hedge this with some element of uncertainty because I don't know this in the sense that I've experienced myself or what the sort of most robust sort of knowledge is. But then again, such uncertainty attaches to pretty much every claim, so that I don't think it's a very acute sort of uncertainty.
So you said that morality comes from reflection, and then I think that other species, they maybe our moral thinking also comes from like basic feelings of empathy or something. So then, yeah. But actually, what you just described was a bit, I think, in that reason that's building blocks of morality are maybe inside other species, but more developed in humans, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess some of the. So I guess if you could compare, there are more building blocks present in morality. I mean, so let me give an introduction. What we call morality is, of course, human morality, and I think there's very clearly some certain features of our morality are quite species specific. So if we had evolved as a very different species, the other Jeroen might disagree with me, but then we would have endorsed certain different norms. Not all of them, but certain ones would have been different. So I think that our moral codes are quite species unique, and in that sense, the building blocks of these codes are more centrally present for human beings, for obvious reasons, than for other species, because morality is a sort of human construct in the end. But then, so adding to these building blocks, so you might see it like there are these basic building blocks. We get along with each other. We don't try to hit each other or rape each other when we first encounter, but we try to make conversation. And then building from that sort of very basic impulse, we have made much more elaborate moral codes, which are codified in certain institutions and which are like taken up in cultural settings, refined, teach to us by our parents, etc. So this whole sort of historical process of refining these basic building blocks has, of course, amended the ultimate moral judgments that we endorse. But that's where they come from ultimately. Yeah.
All right, focusing on humans for a second. Up till now, we have more or less talked about humans as a uniform group, so like all humans are equal. But my question would pertain to what happens when we take class differences, for example, into account. So, for example, a very wealthy and very powerful person would probably get away with a lot more, like wrongdoing, so to say, than a person who is of lower class. And this would also be more or less rational, since he can get away with it. What I'm wondering is if the morality that we're talking about, the moral standards, would equally apply at every level in society, or is it actually an individual rational choice which also takes into account this specific context for every person as such?
Right, that's a good question. It's also a difficult question to answer at a very general level, I guess. But I would say that there are basic moral norms that will apply to everybody. So I mean, the question is, what makes these norms apply to everybody? My view on this would be that ultimately it is because we hold each other responsible and because we agree about many things that ought to be done and how we ought to treat each other. And because there's such agreement, you can sort of force others to conform to certain norms or behavior which make society go and cooperation go smoothly. And so if there are certain people who don't obey by these rules and who make their own rules, then they are acting immoral. And in fact, we have sort of objectified our moral standards and externalized them from ourselves in such a way that they seem to be completely external to us, and which makes it all the more easy to say that if somebody is transgressing a norm, that he or she is doing the wrong thing, because there are these objectified standards where we can hold him or her to. So I would say that if somebody, even if she is extremely rich and good looking, would still be do something wrong if such a basic norm is transgressed. But I mean, added to that, there is of course some cultural diversity, and it's not like everything is carved in stone. Ultimately, what I also said, I think that moral norms are the product of an open-ended and unending process of social dialogue. So it's not that they're handed to us from above. It is the moral truths, so to say, are the truths that we ultimately discover in the process of providing arguments to each other and responding to that. And in such a way, we ultimately figure out what is the right way to treat each other. And that might, of course, depend and vary in different times, in different technological, cultural settings, etc. So there might be some contextual diversity to what the moral norms are or should be.
Thank you. Jeroen first, do you want to react on the speech of Jeroen the second? Like, I think there were some similarities, but There are a lot of things you say, okay, I don't agree, or please explain.
Well, so maybe if I can react by just asking a question.
But yeah.
Am I, yeah? No, not so much? Hello?
This work.
Maybe, yeah, my mouth should be closer to this. I don't know, is there anything I should do? Like the people in the... It's okay? Okay, it's okay. It's okay, it's okay. All right, so question. I guess I'm I want to sort of explore the connections and tensions between what we said. And I'd be curious to hear a little bit more on whether you take sort of you said a lot about how morality developed from an evolutionary perspective. And I wonder to what extent do you take that evolutionary story to undermine the idea that there are objective moral norms? So that's really sort of a basic question I have.
Right. Well, the short answer is that depends on how you define objectivity. So if you define objectivity in a very strong sense as being norms that are completely independent of human inclinations, etc., that don't depend on us in any way, then I think that an evolutionary account shows that in many ways that sort of very objective idea about what moral norms are, that is sort of perhaps not undermined, but put into question, and so there are reasons to doubt that.
Right. So morality having to do at least something with the kind of physical beings that we are, and what is painful to us and what makes us feel good. Morality sort of has related to that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So I think I agree with that. But I guess I sort of heard you talking about, on the one hand, morality being this sort of social deliberative project in which we sort of try to come up with what works best for all of us. But then you also said things about discovering the truth, right? And finding out what the right thing to do is. So it strikes me that these two things can be in tension, right? On the one hand, if it's up to us to decide, what morality is, then it's not about discovering what the right thing to do is. It's about, deciding that, and deciding is something else than discovering. So maybe, can you comment a little bit more on that?
Yeah, I could. I'm not in favor of the discovery metaphor either, because I think that doesn't really capture my view. So if I said that, I didn't really mean that. The better metaphor, I think, would be exploring. It's not quite constructing either, because it's not just, construction seems to be arbitrary, and moral norms are definitely not arbitrary, because they reflect who we are, how we evolved, how we get along with each other, what works well under certain conditions in society, in a certain technological predicament, given all the capacities we have, etc. But it's sort of exploring what is possible within that framework, and thereby we figure out what works for us, for most people, what doesn't work, and in the end, the people whose voices are taken into account in the sort of social discussion that we conduct, that will heavily influence what moral truths we arrive at.
Right. So then, can I?
Yeah, you can. No.
Okay. Yeah, I don't want to take up too much time, because all these people, look at them. So you think morality in that way is, I guess, more like traffic laws then? We sort of, we think of what works best. If everyone sort of drives on the right, then, we come up with these rules. That just sort of works better for everyone than, if we decide what to do individually. So morality is like that.
To some extent, it depends on which traffic rules. So, for example, driving on the right side or the left side, that's purely arbitrary. That would be a constructed rule. Yeah. Doesn't matter. There are other traffic.
All do the same, right?
Yeah, as long as we all do the same. Yeah.
Yeah.
But there are other traffic rules which clearly work better or less well. So, for example, the sort of norm that you shouldn't bump your car to the car next to you. That is, perhaps that was not obvious, but you sort of explore what happens during traffic, and then you find out that works very bad in many ways, and that's something very unwanted. So that's how we figure out what works well and what doesn't.
Let's make a shortcut, and then you can also react on Jeroen the first. He made a very strong point about, if you atheistic or people who don't believe in something supernatural, they have a difficulty in finding or exploring morality or moral objectives. I don't know exactly about your background, but your line of thought was more like it's more exploring. It doesn't matter exactly what kind of religion or you have. I think. How do you react on that point? Like, there should be something out of this world to be to give our something moral objectives.
No, so I don't agree with that. I think that might be required if you think that moral norms are these very objective norms. Then I don't really see what might be in place as a as a ground for these norms or as a foundation, like something divine. But I don't think that. I think moral norms are objective, but I don't think they're objective in this super robust sense. They're objective in a much more moderate, reflective sense instead of the.
But you agreed on that.
Yeah, I don't think I did, but we're sort of using the same word in different meanings.
Yeah, that's difficult.
Yeah, it's what philosophers do. Yeah. So I get what I agreed to was the thought that moral norms have something to do with who we are as physical beings. So how what is painful to us and what feels good to us, these sorts of things. But I still do think that moral norms are sort of objective in a sense that's sort of external to us. In the sense that we don't make them, right? So it's not up to us to construct these things. They're sort of given from the outside. So that's the sense in which I'm disagreeing.
Yeah, but Jeroen the second says, we don't make them, we explore them, or not?
Yeah, exactly. That would be my response. I mean, I think constructing is too much of a character. We sort of explore what works for us, given the human condition, etc. And yeah, well, I was going to say something else, but I forgot it.
Well, maybe some reaction that like, isn't it possible to explore moral norms without believing in something of someone supernatural?
Oh yeah, sure. I mean, everything's possible. Well, not everything, but I mean, yeah. I mean, of course we do. I mean, we do think about, and that's what moral reflection is about. In a way, it is about exploring. But I mean, I would be more in favor of the metaphor of discovering, because I do think there are. I mean, it's not, exploring sounds like there could be many different endpoints. Maybe not everywhere, but it's not just sort of. There's no single right answer, and that's the sort of view I'm championing here. I'm saying, yeah, there are objectively correct answers, unique ones. And merely sort of I mean, what's guiding the exploring here? Who's to say when we've reached a satisfactory endpoint? Because I mean, sort of maybe exaggerating a bit or pushing the point. So take the issue of climate change, right? I mean, why should we care about that? I mean, yeah, okay, so in a way, it's obvious why we should, because we're going to go extinct, right, if we do nothing about it. But why is that important? Why would it be a bad thing from, like, the perspective of evolutionary history, the grand narrative of where the world came from, and why would it be a bad thing if people would go extinct? I mean, happened to dinosaurs, tough luck. So what's different about humans?
Sure. So fair enough. From the perspective of, I mean, evolution doesn't have like a perspective of valuing. So evolution, Mother Nature doesn't care. And from the sort of like the perspective of the universe, if you we once human beings once evolved, and we will go extinct probably, and our solar system emerged, and one day we will live in a very cool universe, and everything will be very far apart, and there will be no life at all. So from that sort of the perspective of unitariety, nothing really matters. I mean, that's the sort of bullet that you have to bite, on my view. I think it's not very a big problem, because that's simply not the sort of level at which we actually think about what matters. What matters for us are interactions with the people I care about, with specific individuals. It's not, I never make these interactions from the standpoint of the universe, but I make them in my daily life, in daily practices. And from that perspective, many things matter. People matter to me, and that is sort of the basic for what matters to me. And from my perspective, the future of humanity matters as well. So I think that ultimately, these internal feelings provide the source of our moral foundations.
Maybe we've got about 20 minutes. Focus on the issue, the question on the poster, like what motivates us to do good. And when I heard your talk, you're on the first. It was your children who learned you some kind of sense of morality and your imperfection. And in your first talk, you told about. Well, maybe there's some kind of division between those two talks. Like in the first talk, you had it about you need a god or a supernatural something someone for moral objectives. And in the second talk, you didn't come back on that. Well, when it comes down to what motivates you to do good, or motivates people to do good, well, is it more other people, or has to do with your religion?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess the thing to say is what motivates us to do good. I mean, it can be many things, right? It could be a sense that there is this higher being to which we owe obedience. It could be your children. I mean, it could be reading the biographies of very inspirational people. It could be plain instruction, right? Sometimes especially with young kids, parents just tell them that they need to say thank you when they're given something. So I mean, there's that. And also, I mean, I do think reflection and deliberation is very important. So that also, I mean, when you think about things, sometimes you just see more clearly what needs to be done, and that too might motivate you. So, yeah, it's really sort of there's different answers here, and they can all be true.
Yeah. Maybe same question, not the same question, of course, but a similar question. When you, given just one sentence an answer on the question, what motivates people, or humankind, to do good? What would you say as a philosopher? What is essentially making people doing good?
Well, I mean, I agree with Jeroen the first. There are many different reasons which motivate. To just give one personal example, I was in South Africa last week in Cape Town, and there's a big water shortage in Cape Town. And so, as a result of that, people are, for example, catching the water in a basket underneath the shower, so they can reuse this basket to water their garden. Or when you go to the toilet and you just have to take a pee, you don't flush the toilet anymore, but you just leave it for the next person who won't flush it either. So and that's more than fine. So I noticed that coming back to the Netherlands this week, I became a little bit more liberal in flushing the toilet, and I was much more aware of the the water we just let go to waste. And I found that interesting because it shows that a sort of nudge or maybe the necessity to act and to save water that can motivate you to do that, but then subsequently you realize, well, actually I didn't need that water at all. So I think that sort of nudges from society, they can be, that's just one of the very many motives, but they can play an important role. And if we are sort of nudged in a certain direction, we can do much better in moral terms.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I do have some questions about that, but let's first go to all the people here. Questions, remarks, discussions, especially about the question, what motivates us to do good? Or maybe, yeah.
I just have a question for the second Jeroen about what you just said. Does that also mean that you think that autistic people, for example, who aren't really capable sometimes of feeling and thinking of what other people feel, that they don't have a morale? Because if it's only dependent on, well, what other people think and knowing what problems they have, if you just don't see it, where do you get your morale from?
Should people be reflective to be moral people? Yeah.
So my prediction would be that if you create two societies, one consisting of 100 autistic children and one consisting of a neurodiverse population, let's say, and if you let them get along for 10 years and then see what are the sort of shared standards they adhere to, then I think that you will find interesting differences between the one society and the other. And I think that the standards that the neurodiverse community adheres to are closer to what we would ordinarily call moral standards. So in that sense, I think that, yes, autism or psychopaths, which are the more sort of standard philosophical example because it's a more extreme case and easier to relate to it, yes, they will have a lesser capacity to act morally. I don't think it's completely absent, because I think they do share certain basic emotions, etc., that are relevant to act morally, but I think it will make a difference.
You're doubting. Yep.
Yes, I have another question. Second, Jeroen, for referring to your talk, you referred a lot to evolutionary explanations for human behavior, moral behavior. And when we consider the evolution theory, then we have a theory which is rooted in scientific thinking and naturalistic thinking. So when I can perfectly follow and agree with a lot of your arguments, but I think that in a theory which comes from naturalistic origins, you can never find a place for God, because it's not there in the beginning from which it was rooted. So it seems like you are talking on kind of different dimensions sometimes, or I don't know the word, but from very different viewpoints. And then I was wondering, do you think these views can coexist? And if not, how much do you think your rational thinking comes from maybe your belief in the first place, or your convictions in the first place?
Do you grasp the question? It's rather complicated, but
Complicated, but a fair question, and I think your observation is correct. So, I mean, if you come from a very different background, if you are of a theistic perspective, if you're then what I'm saying might strike you as very surprising and odd and difficult to relate to, etc. And the same might go the other way around. So I think that, it is difficult to reconcile these perspectives, and ultimately I think that one of them is the better one. It's up to you to guess which one. But I mean, I don't want to deny anybody his sort of personal moral motivation, and I also think that religion can, in some occasions at least, do much good in moral terms. But I mean, it's a different question whether God exists or whether we should believe in God, etc. That's a different topic, and I think ultimately there are good reasons to say no. But that's a different topic.
Yeah.
The question was also to you.
Yeah. I mean, so I think Jeroen is right that sort of there is this, there is a tension between the two. I mean, I also think that like theism, or sort of belief in God, is to a large extent compatible with an evolutionary story about where humans came from and how they developed their moral thinking. So in a way, it's sort of you might even think that theism has a sort of strategic edge there. It can sort of incorporate a lot of evolutionary thinking, but also say that there's a God. Whether you think that's a good thing is, but so I do think there is a lot of compatibility. Of course, there is incompatibility when it comes to the ultimate foundation of these moral norms. I mean, on a purely evolutionary or naturalistic account, there's not going to be any room for saying there's a supernatural being involved or a supernatural foundation. And so the other way around, a theist is going to say, so all of that, the scientific story about how our evolutionary thinking developed, that might be right, but it cannot be the full story, right? There's sort of more to it, because there's also the subjective rightness and wrongness that I try to impress upon you. And so as a theist, you need to then sort of tell some story about how we human beings sort of have access to these objective moral norms, how we can come to know them. And that, so that's, I mean, I do think reflection plays an important role there, also a sense of moral intuition. I also think revelation is important there. So it can be diverse sources, but as a theist, you need to sort of have some story about our access to these moral norms.
Okay. Oh, the question in the middle.
My question might be a bit off topic, but I don't know when I would get another philosopher. So I'll just go ahead and ask you. It's mostly for Jeroen the second. Have you ever seen something. It could be a movie or it could be a simple encounter. And have you ever cried? Because something that you saw or something that you've heard really hurt you and cried, and you actually said, I want to do something about it. It's not something that you can get, that you'll get something out of, but simply totally unrelated with you. But you felt so bad and you actually empathized and you said, okay, I should do something about this. Is there some kind of evolutionary or naturalistic explanation for that feeling of, well, empathy or sadness or whatever it is?
Have I ever cried? Well, I tend to cry a lot at movies. I'm very weak-hearted, and so yes. So I mean, we are as humans. We are also very much storytelling creatures, and I think it's quite amazing that looking at a movie, which is just like a screen where light is projected on, and with some sounds coming from the background, we can get emotional and we can cry. So that's quite stunning. I mean, why is that? Because I follow the story in my mind and I relate to these people and I find it sad when something bad happens to one of them and I empathize with them. So I mean, that is the sort of basic explanation. We empathize, we care about each other, we care about people, everybody, we all know that because we all do that with regard to our family or friends in all daily interactions, etc. When we see somebody falling down on the street, we are inclined to help him and pick him up. You know? So that's the sort of basic emotion we all have, and I have it too.
But, well, to extend the question, in what way plays it a role in doing good? Doing good in general, like, well, maybe you call it your moral intuition or your anger or your sadness because you see something. Is that moral intuition? Is that something that it's well nudged by the surroundings, or has it to do with because it refers to some moral objective? Why get people something touched by like Al Gore or Martin Luther King, or maybe you all know stories in your own personal life? People who are touched by something and then do good, or in their view, good for other people. Why is that, and how does it work morally?
Why is it? How does it work? Yeah, that's lots of questions, right? Yeah, so why is it? So I mean, for me, the ultimate answer would be, well, it has to do with seeing what the right thing to do is. So perceiving or appreciating these moral truths. And I mean, sometimes seeing that things are not the way they're supposed to be and caring about that, right? So on the one hand, there is sort of appreciating and perceiving involved, so seeing that things are a certain way. And there's also a motivational component to it, and sort of caring about things being better, needing to be better. Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question actually, but yeah.
And I agree with the metaphors, but I don't agree with what's behind it. So of course, I mean, in a sense, we see what's the right thing to. I mean, that's also what Al Gore said in that video clip, and I agree with the metaphor, but I don't agree if you think about seeing what's the right thing to as sort of perceiving a moral truth. I really don't see what's behind the metaphor in the end, because I mean, we don't have a sort of faculty comparable to our visual faculty in which we can really see these things. So it's very unclear like how to explain that from a scientific point of view. It is much clearer to explain it from a scientific point of view if you think about these sort of evolved emotions and how the subsequently get taken up in moral discussion, etc. And then you can see what's the right thing to do because you have these sort of involved motivations, plus you care about each other, plus you know and you can reason your way through what the right thing to do is. So given that we have these basic motivations, you can see what you actually should do. But seeing doesn't mean relating to some moral fact out there. It relates ultimately to a moral fact that we have together find out that it's worth pursuing.
Yeah. Another question. Always the questions most far off.
Yes, I have a question for most for Jeroen the first. Moral should motivate us. We are talking about this, I guess. But when I think that acting conform my morals or conform moral is good and it makes me feel good, isn't it just egocentric to do good or to act conform moral?
Yeah, is acting according to your moral standards ultimately in your self-interest or about feeling good about yourself? Yeah, of course. I mean, it's sort of hard to falsify that kind of view, right? Because I mean, what do you say to? I mean, if someone tells you no, I mean, it wasn't about me feeling good. I was really sort of caring about this other person, and I wanted to help them. Well, I mean, you can always say, yeah, sure, you say that, but caring and saying that you cared about someone else really just made you feel good, and that's so in a way it's impossible to disprove this sort of view. But that gets me worried, right? If certain views are just impossible to disprove, it's kind of unclear that they're really saying anything. If someone always has the same answer to a question, then maybe that isn't a real answer at all. So I would be, yeah. I mean, I guess I'm sort of more inclined to take things at face value and sort of look at my own moral inner life, as it were. And there, I mean, I sort of experience that, sure, sometimes I do things because they make me feel good. But sometimes I do things because I think I really must do them. And, getting back to my kids, getting up in the middle of the night and changing diapers and stuff, it doesn't at all seem like that makes me feel so good. Maybe sort of retrospectively, ultimately it makes me feel better about myself. I don't know, but I mean, the reason why you do that, or giving money to people you don't know, or just listening to a student, I mean, I have lots of things. No, I mean, not you, sorry. Oh, that was... All right, forget about that example. So sometimes you take time out of your busy agenda and just talk to someone and listen to their problems. That doesn't automatically make me feel good, but I think it's important to do that because other people have their concerns and sometimes they need help and they need someone who listens to them. Yeah, that isn't sort of stuff that makes me feel good immediately. I do it because I care about people. So I sort of prefer to go with that than rather than the skeptical. It's all about self-interest.
Yes. Well, maybe a last question. Imagine you are both promoted like ministers in the cabinet, in the government, and you're ministers for motivating people to do good.
Finally,
because the government always wants people to do good and to take care of each other. And, well, you're the experts. What are you going to do? How do you take care that people are doing the good things for other people? Your budget is rather large. It's not a problem. Huh?
Whew.
Yeah.
Let's do it in order of numbers.
Yeah, why not? I don't know. I mean, this is obviously a very difficult question. What do you do? Well, I mean, I guess, no matter what philosophers think about morality, I think you need to sort of, look to psychology and the other sciences to learn more about, what gets people to act in certain ways. And maybe, the sort of nudges that Jeroen talked about would be a good way of getting people to do better. Maybe, because, the worry here is that sort of forcing morality on people from above is tricky, right? Morality, ideally, it's something that sort of comes from an internal motivation, and that's exactly the sort of thing that's really hard to implement through like public policies or something. So maybe you can sort of channel some things a little bit more and promote certain ways of doing good. And I mean, our government does that. And I think, yeah, as sort of, I guess it's really a bad job description. Yeah.
Okay, you're in the second.
Well, to take one historical example, abolishing slavery, which happened in many countries in the 18th and 19th centuries, people knew long before that there were many things wrong about slavery. But why was it ultimately abolished in the UK and in the US? Because the whole economic system was oriented about, initially it was oriented about getting money from slave labor. And because the sort of economy changed and new wage labor emerged in a sort of economic system of free trade, etc., where people could earn their own money, and because people could be given contracts and work for a contract, and so like free labor became economically viable. And this was actually the turning point in the abolishing of slavery, that an abolition movement, which had already existed, because people knew that slavery was in many respects immoral, but then it finally became effective. So that's the sort of a little bit, perhaps not too a rosy outlook, but it really, the sort of personal incentives help. If you can earn money by doing something morally good, and if it's an economically viable alternative, then that will work. So in this sense, I think that the cultural and social institutions make a big difference. But maybe to add one more thing, which is a little bit more positive, I think to think back about Al Gore's speech, what he did was objectifying the issue, saying there's right and wrong, there are two choices, make it in a bipolar choice, and that in the end makes sure that you've got sort of the people on your side and you can force them to do the right thing. You make it a sort of forced choice. And I think that really helps. And that's one of the reasons why morality has often been objectified throughout history, because making things seem objective, making this sort of apparent external need to behave morally, I mean, that's really something that incentivizes people and that helps people to behave morally. So if you want to get people on your side, just pretend and that the issue is really objective, and get other people to believe it, and they will work for it.
And get rid of philosophers like you, who sort of claim that it's all an illusion, right? This objective morality.
Right. Yeah.
Well, that's more a discussion during the drinks, maybe.
Discussion and other things.
Let's finish this discussion, and the central question: what motivates people to do good? I think we discovered it's a difficult question. You need more sciences than only philosophers, but also other disciplines. But I think also what you really did very well is discussing about what is essentially good, and is there a morality, and is there objective morality, objective norms, moral norms. I asked at the beginning during dinner on the committee, when are you satisfied with this evening? They said, well, when people go to home and they keep on thinking. So maybe you don't have all the answers. I don't have. I hope personally you don't have all the answers, because then you're wrong. But maybe you have some answers. But I hope, especially, that you have a lot of questions and think, this interesting. Maybe I should think more about this issue or that issue. Then okay, we're glad. You're glad. I'm glad. Thank you. Thank you. You're doing a good job listening to philosophers. Thank you very much, and also by really participating in discussion and the questions. Really thank you, both of the Jeroenen, for your talks and your insights, and the way you did it. It was really really good, I think. Thank you.